I want you to imagine a quiet night somewhere in the vast Pacific Ocean, the stars overhead blurred by a haze of salt spray and tension. On the deck of a massive American warship stands a man known for his fiery temperament, inspirational speeches, and intense loyalty to his country and crew. This is William Bull Halsey, a name synonymous with speed, aggression, and a brand of leadership that redefined the United States Navy during World War II. But beneath his determined veneer, hidden behind the iconic cap and unwavering gaze, there was an individual constantly balancing personal conviction with enormous strategic responsibilities. His story is not just one of monumental battles and headlines about victories or storms. It's a deeply human journey that carried him from a comfortable childhood to the brutal realities of the largest naval war in history. As we stand on the brink of diving into his life, consider this question. How does a leader cope with being simultaneously hailed as a hero and criticized for decisions that cost many lives? It's a question that dogged Halsey through some of the most pivotal chapters in the Pacific theater, and one that still sparks debate among historians today. To understand the complexity of the man who became America's fighting admiral, we first need to step away from the roar of aircraft engines and the thunder of naval batteries. We need to step back in time to the childhood that shaped his earliest ambitions, to the small moments that guided him toward the naval tradition he would one day come to symbolize. William Frederick Halsey Jr. was born on October 30th, 1882, in Elizabeth, New Jersey. His father, William Frederick Halsey Sr., was himself a naval officer, and the family existed in that peculiar space between deeply American traditions and the traveling lifestyle typical of military families. By all accounts, the Halsey household was stable and nurturing. His mother, Anne Brewster, had a stern but affectionate way of reinforcing moral codes that stressed loyalty, perseverance, and respect for the uniform. There were no illusions that life was guaranteed to be easy, but there was also a belief that with enough determination and moral grounding, one could achieve greatness. Young William, who would become known by all simply as Bill before any notion of Bull entered the picture, spent many childhood evenings enthralled by his father's tales of the sea. The older Halsey's stories spoke of strong camaraderie, overseas adventures, and a certain intangible pride that came with wearing the Navy's colors. While other children were reading dime novels about the Wild West, Bill was quietly absorbing every detail about exotic ports, battles in far-off lands, and a tradition that stretched back to the earliest days of the U.S. Navy. Looking back later in his life, he recalled a poignant moment when as a boy he saw his father in full-dress uniform before a formal ceremony. The polished buttons, the crisp lines, and the understated authority in his father's expression left an imprint on his young mind. He knew in that instant that the Navy might well be his destiny too. He wasn't merely a dreamy child, though. Behind the boyish fascination with warships and foreign harbors lay a spirit of competitiveness. In school, he was quick to jump into athletic pursuits. He played football, baseball, and demonstrated a fearless approach that presaged his future naval persona. Though not the biggest nor the fastest on the field, he compensated with grit and leadership. Teachers and coaches often remarked on his unique combination of discipline and light-hearted mischief. A certain rebellious streak occasionally showed itself. He would quietly protest rules he found nonsensical, but overall, he respected authority when he believed it had a purpose. This balancing act between respect for chain of command and the internal desire to question the status quo became a subtle hallmark of his character. As he approached high school graduation, the influence of his father's career and his own fascination with all things maritime pointed inevitably toward the United States Naval Academy. Family acquaintances recall him seldom expressing serious interest in anything else. He admired the Army, but the Navy was in his blood. In 1900, he took the entrance exams and was admitted to the Naval Academy at Annapolis, joining the ranks of those who would go on to fill the quarterdecks of American warships. At the Academy, Bill Halsey confronted a world of exacting discipline, rigid schedules, and stern instruction. From dawn drills to the unrelenting academic workload, the Naval Academy tested his resolve. Early on, he was confronted with the simple but grueling task of learning how to navigate not just water, but the layered hierarchy of an institution that prided itself on tradition. He was not an exceptional student academically. He was somewhere near the middle of the pack, but he excelled in leadership roles among his peers, demonstrating an ability to organize and inspire others. Physical training and sports once again provided an outlet for his competitive spirit, and while the demands of the academy were high, he thrived on the structure and sense of purpose it provided. He soon encountered mentors who spotted in him the seeds of a remarkable leader. Some were tough disciplinarians who forced him to focus on detail, an essential skill for any seagoing officer, but equally significant were the older officers who taught him that leadership was about more than barking orders. It was about cultivating a sense of unity and mutual respect among sailors in cramped quarters for extended periods, especially in times of war. One anecdote from those early days stands out. A senior instructor rebuked Bill for failing to correct a junior's mistake in practice drills, reminding him that an officer's responsibility is not only to do his own job well, but also to elevate the performance of those around him. That lesson sank in and stayed with him for life. Commissioned as an ensign upon graduation, he began his first tours at sea, witnessing daily how the Navy functioned in peacetime. These were voyages that built the professional foundation he would rely on when war eventually came. One of his early postings took him to the Asiatic Fleet, where he saw a part of the world teetering on the brink of dramatic change. With each new port, he observed local cultures, strategic tensions, and how the American flag was perceived abroad. In letters home to his parents, he expressed a blend of excitement and caution about the evolving face of naval warfare. Battleships were growing bigger, technology was racing forward, and the seeds of future conflicts were being sown in international rivalries. By the time the United States entered World War I, Bill Halsey was eager to prove himself. He transferred to the destroyer service, an environment that seemed to fit his aggressive personality. Speed and maneuverability, the essential qualities of destroyers, resonated with how he approached almost everything in life. During the First World War, he served with distinction, rising through the ranks. While he wasn't commanding massive fleets then, the experience solidified his confidence and taught him about the importance of anticipating an enemy's moves. Between the two world wars, a more methodical Bill Halsey emerged. Though still known for his boisterous laugh and love for a strong cup of coffee, he continued to sharpen his skills, transitioning to aviation by earning his wings as a naval aviator at the relatively late age of 52. This was a critical career decision. At a time when battleships still dominated naval thinking, Halsey recognized the growing importance of aircraft carriers and the power of air superiority. As one of the older naval officers to embrace aviation, he underscored his ability to adapt. The big gun admirals of the interwar period were not always receptive to carrier warfare strategies, but Halsey's foresight proved invaluable once the U.S. was propelled into World War II. The day that would forever alter Halsey's life and the rest of the country arrived on December 7th, 1941, with a Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. The shockwaves reverberated not just through the ranks of the Navy, but through every corner of American society. At this juncture, Halsey was commanding aircraft carriers in the Pacific, already alert to the possibility that Japan would strike. He was at sea at the time, and the sight of burning battleships upon his return left an indelible mark on him. For many who encountered him in the days following, there was a raw, visible anger in the admiral's demeanor. He famously declared that when he found the enemy, they would be mine. He was itching to retaliate, to deliver a blow that would right the colossal wrong done at Pearl Harbor. It didn't take long for that opportunity to come. As early as April 1942, Halsey played a crucial role in the Doolittle raid on Tokyo, a daring operation led by Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle. Though the raid was modest in its physical damage, it was monumental in its psychological impact. It told the Japanese people they were not invulnerable, and it gave Americans a desperately needed morale boost after the shock of Pearl Harbor. Halsey's leadership style, aggressive and decisive, was tailor-made for such an audacious plan. When critics argued the risk was too great, Halsey argued that audacity and strategic surprise outweighed potential losses. The success of the raid, from the Navy's perspective, bolstered his reputation as a commander willing to push the envelope. Yet the true test of his strategic mind came in the long series of naval engagements collectively known as the Guadalcanal Campaign. It was here, in the waters around the Solomon Islands, that the U.S. Navy and Marines locked horns with Japanese forces in brutal seesaw fighting that tested the mettle of both sides. Halsey was tasked with overseeing a campaign that combined air, land, and sea forces in one of the first major offensives against Japan. The conditions were unforgiving: the sweltering climate, the impenetrable jungles, the relentless possibility of disease, and an enemy determined not to yield an inch without exacting a terrible cost. Halsey threw his weight and energy into the struggle. He placed enormous emphasis on supporting the Marines on the ground, making sure they had as much naval and aerial cover as he could muster. He also allowed his commanders a fair degree of autonomy, encouraging initiative when communication lines were thin or broken. Decisions at sea sometimes had to be made in minutes. There was no time to check with higher-ups in Washington. This environment of trust invigorated some subordinates, but also placed a heavier burden on them to make the right calls. In several key naval battles, like the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands and the naval battle of Guadalcanal, Halsey's forces secured narrow but vital victories that turned the tide of the campaign. From these experiences, Halsey's name became a household word across the United States. Newspapers picked up on his nickname, Bull, which reportedly derived from his readiness to charge into a fight and his outspoken manner of speech. At a time when the American public yearned for heroes, Halsey fit the image perfectly. He was neither a remote strategist in a plush office nor a faceless bureaucrat. He was out at sea, in the thick of it, taking risks right alongside his men. This enhanced his public standing, and he later received promotions that placed him in overall command of ever larger fleet operations in the Pacific. Yet fame, of course, had its shadows, and controversies began to swirl around the famed admiral. One of the most significant controversies of his career arose during the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944, which was one of the largest naval battles in history and a critical moment in the liberation of the Philippines. Halsey's Third Fleet had the daunting task of blocking the Imperial Japanese Navy and protecting the invasion forces landing on Leyte. However, the Japanese executed a complex plan intended to lure Halsey's powerful carrier forces away from the critical landing beaches. When a decoy force under Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa appeared to the north, Halsey famously took the bait, moving his carriers northward to strike what he believed to be the main threat. This maneuver left the San Bernardino Strait unguarded, opening a gap for a Japanese battleship force to threaten the invasion beachhead. For a tense span of time, the U.S. landing forces and the smaller covering units under Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague had to fight off a numerically and technically superior Japanese surface fleet. It was a moment of high drama. Ultimately, a combination of determined American resistance and Japanese hesitation caused the enemy battleships to withdraw. But the incident sparked outrage and confusion among many Allied commanders. Critics argued Halsey had acted impulsively, risking the entire operation. Defenders countered that he had no way of knowing if the Northern force was indeed a decoy, and his instincts had always been to attack, attack, attack. The issue never fully died down, and Halsey carried a sense of regret that he wasn't there to prevent the near disaster. He would later reflect on this moment as a painful lesson in balancing offensive aggression with overarching strategic obligations. Another sensitive episode came with Typhoon Cobra in December 1944, when Halsey's fleet sailed into a fierce tropical storm that sank 3 destroyers and damaged many other ships. Over 700 men lost their lives to the raging sea. Critics contended that Halsey had either ignored or underestimated warnings about the storm. He was subsequently called to account for his decisions in a court of inquiry, which found that while errors had been made, they did not rise to the level of requiring severe disciplinary action. Nonetheless, the incident further highlighted the pressures and fallibilities of command at such scale. Even legends can fail, and fail catastrophically, when the unexpected or unstoppable natural forces come into play. Like many of his contemporaries, Halsey faced these controversies as part of the inevitable burden of command. He never completely shed the criticisms, but neither did they wholly tarnish his reputation. Instead, they introduced a moral and psychological nuance to his image, reminding the public and historians alike that leadership is fraught with difficult choices. Halsey's own reflections on these events were tinged with sorrow for the losses incurred and the knowledge that each decision he made in the heat of battle had far-reaching consequences. Away from the tumult of war, William Halsey was a devoted family man. He married Frances Grandy in 1909, and while naval life meant extended absences, they maintained a loving partnership. Friends and family described Frances as a stabilizing influence in Halsey's life. She understood that the man known to the world as Bull was also the father to her children, carrying a softer side that surfaced in personal letters and rare, quiet evenings at home. That said, the separations wrought by his deployments did leave him with an undercurrent of guilt. Like many wartime leaders, he missed milestones in his children's lives, and there was a constant worry that the war might rob him of the chance to ever return. He also wrestled, particularly later, with episodes of exhaustion, both physical and mental. The relentless stress of battle and the knowledge that each misstep could cost thousands of lives took a toll. While there's no direct evidence he suffered from conditions like what we would now call PTSD, there were accounts from close associates who noted he sometimes seemed moody or introspective, especially after storms like Typhoon Cobra or controversies like Leyte Gulf. He also had his share of illnesses, one of which temporarily removed him from active service during the war. Officially described as dermatitis, it was rumored his health concerns might have been exacerbated by stress, though the details remain vague. Outside of the uniform, Halsey found simple joys in reading, particularly history, and he maintained a lifelong curiosity about maritime exploration. Whenever he had a chance, he loved to talk about the voyages of Captain Cook or the epic journeys of early American naval expeditions. It was a reminder that for all the heated aggression that characterized his public image, there was a reflective side, a man who admired human endurance and daring even beyond the battlefield. When the war finally ended in 1945, Halsey stood at the pinnacle of his profession. He had earned the 5-star rank of Fleet Admiral, one of only 4 men in U.S. history to do so in the Navy. He was on board the USS Missouri when the Japanese formally surrendered in Tokyo Bay on September 2, 1945, symbolically marking the close of a conflict that had cost millions of lives. After years at sea, he now faced an entirely different challenge: transition to peacetime. His post-war years involved a range of activities designed to help the nation heal and remember. Halsey served in advisory roles, gave lectures, and performed ceremonial duties. He was passionate about veterans' affairs, believing firmly and recognizing the sacrifices of those who served in the Pacific. Often, he would take time to visit hospitals or speak at gatherings, not just for the public, but also for the men who had fought under him. He wrote articles about the war and occasionally touched on the controversies, though he largely kept the deeper introspection to himself. In a world now shifting toward the Cold War, Halsey sometimes lamented that humanity never seemed to learn from its bloodiest experiences, but he also championed the idea that a strong Navy was essential to preventing future conflict. His health continued to decline as he aged, and in his final years he dealt with a variety of ailments, including heart problems. He never quite lost that spark of defiance. Friends remember that even when he was struggling physically, he would regale listeners with war stories and opinions on modern strategic developments. He passed away on August 16, 1959, at the age of 76. News of his death brought tributes from across the country and around the world. The outpouring spoke of his bravery, his leadership, and how he had become an icon of the U.S. Navy. At its most tested moment, his funeral was held with full military honors, and his ashes were interred at Arlington National Cemetery, ensuring he would rest among the countless others who served their country in uniform. Even in death, William Bull Halsey's influence continued to ripple through the ranks of naval strategy. He had been a pivotal figure in transitioning the Navy's emphasis from battleships to carrier warfare. New generations of officers studied his decisions, both his triumphs and his errors, to glean insights into the responsibilities of high command. For many Americans, Halsey became a representation of the determined spirit that overcame the Axis powers in World War II. His name can still be found on ships, monuments, and in documentaries that highlight the strategies employed in the Pacific. Museums dedicated to naval history often feature sections on his leadership at Guadalcanal, the Doolittle raid, and the aftermath of Pearl Harbor. Scholars and historians remain divided on certain aspects of his career, particularly Leyte Gulf, but all tend to agree that without Halsey's unyielding drive, the war in the Pacific might have looked very different indeed. There are also more personal testaments to his legacy. Family archives contain letters and memoirs that offer glimpses of the man behind the cap. In those, you see expressions of longing for home during the war, paternal pride in his children's achievements, and even an abiding sense of sorrow for the men lost at sea under his command. One recently revealed diary entry shared by relatives touches on his reaction after one particularly harrowing engagement. "I do not fear the fight. I fear failing those who trust me." It's a line that underscores the emotional burden of command. Occasionally, you'll find anecdotes passed down from shipmates who recall the admiral's sense of humor even in dire times. One story recounts how, During a particularly tense moment at sea, he walked onto the bridge, observed the worried faces around him, and cracked a wry joke about how, if the Japs didn't sink them first, the coffee probably would. The men who overheard it burst into grateful laughter, the tension lifting for a moment, a reminder that great leaders often rely on human connection and morale-boosting humor as much as on raw strategic skill. Of course, his peers and fellow officers had widely varied opinions. Admirals Chester Nimitz and Raymond Spruance both appreciated Halsey's relentless aggression, though Spruance's more cool-headed style was something of a foil to Halsey's boldness. Marines who served in the Solomons were deeply grateful for the fierce naval and aerial support they received. Sailors on the decks of carriers, cruisers, and destroyers recognized that with Halsey in command, they wouldn't be left idle. There would be action. But you'd also find cautionary voices, some from allies who believed he could be rash. In the decades since, on military forums and in communities of veterans, discussions of Halsey often reflect on this duality, a lion-hearted fighter who sometimes roared too loudly. Reflecting on his life, one cannot help but see in him the embodiment of the broader American experience during World War II, prideful, vengeful after Pearl Harbor, extraordinarily resourceful, and eventually triumphant, albeit bruised by the heavy toll of conflict. Halsey's story illuminates the tangled moral landscape of warfare. He exemplifies both the unstoppable vigor required to defeat a formidable enemy and the inevitable regrets that come with mistakes made in the fog of war. For a modern audience, his life can serve as a cautionary tale about the weight of high-stakes decisions, as well as a testament to the unbreakable human will under fire. If you found this story compelling, there are countless other figures, battles, and campaigns from World War II and other conflicts waiting to be explored. Perhaps you'd like to learn more about the contrasting styles of Admirals Chester Nimitz or Raymond Spruance, or maybe you're interested in the lesser-known battles that played out in the remote corners of the Pacific. Each story offers new perspectives on leadership under fire and the personal cost of war. I hope you'll stay tuned as we continue to investigate the individuals and events that shaped modern history. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the life and legacy of Admiral William Halsey. And until next time, let's keep seeking those deeper truths and shared human lessons that history has to offer.